Okay, so I thought we could start by, I just want to pause for a beat because I know that everybody has pre-existing a pre-existing condition with respect to Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. So I would just invite everybody to just notice, what feelings come up, what bodily sensations come up, what ideas, get triggered. When you see him or think of him, I'm sure childless cat ladies is a phrase showing up in a lot of people's minds. And I wanted to talk about Vance and provide some questions, some framing for how we might think about him from a developmental or integral perspective. For a variety of reasons. It's, I think, pretty clear now he's the heir apparent for the MAGA movement, and will play an outsized role in the shape that it takes after Trump. I came across a quote from Steve Bannon recently that was just pitch perfect. Bannon described Vance as the St. Paul to Trump's Jesus, the zealous convert who spreads the gospel of Trumpism further than Trump himself. Vance is sometimes regarded as sort of the brains of MAGA, somebody who's, worked out the ideology in economic terms, in cultural terms, and so on, more in a more sophisticated manner than Trump himself, arguably. Another reason I think it's good for us to think about him as integralists is he identifies as a post-liberal. And that's a very interesting designation. And there are a lot of influential philosophers and thinkers who he draws on. And post-liberalism often gets the bumper sticker summary of it is right on culture, left on economics. Right on culture, cultural issues, left on economic issues. And that's an interesting and unusual combination that kind of scrambles our usual political categories for how we place politicians. Another reason is he's a work in progress. He's like my age. He's in his early 40s. And so he's developing. And he's developing at a time when the right is churning, is developing more quickly than we can wrap our minds around. So I honestly don't know what to think of him. I don't know what his true motivations are. And so I'm just kind of, this is partly me thinking out loud and trying to make sense in real time of what are we to make of Vance, and if he's going to be the future of the Republican Party and the MAGA movement and conservatism in the US. What might that look like? What is the promise that holds? And what might the upside of that be? And what's the peril of that? What's the potential downside? So that's kind of some big picture, things for us to think about. And a question that is, orienting my remarks and my thinking about this is, what would a conservative integral leader look like? And could Vance fit that bill? Or could he someday fit that bill? And if so, what would the conditions for that be? How would we know to recognize a conservative integral leader if there was one, right in front of us? So that's just some initial framing. A word about the title. I had given Rigel the title Children of Women. Some of you may have noted that that's an allusion to the novel Children of Men by P.D. James, which was turned into a popular film. It's a dystopian novel about a future Britain and future world in which the human race can no longer conceive children. And it kind of plays through the cultural and the political and psychological, implications of that. And so I chose that as my title, partly because Vance himself, as many of you probably know, was largely raised by his grandmother, and so kind of raised by women. but also the so-called fertility crisis, or the birth rate crisis, concern about declining birth rates, is one of, I think, the most animating issues for him in terms of his way of thinking. And I think that drives a lot of how he thinks about policy and how a lot of the new right is going to think about policy. So that's an issue that I want to bring into the conversation toward the end of my remarks. So I'm going to just do a little intro with Vance. I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with him in some aspects of his biography. I want to talk about some of the influences on him, major figures and thinkers, and also some of the issues that he's taken a clear position on, and what some implications might be for the future of the Republican Party and the future of the country generally. Okay, and I'm very interested to hear what your own impressions are of him as a person, as a politician, as a thinker, and how we might categorize him in integral terms or developmental terms. Okay, so Hillbilly Elegy, obviously, what put him on the cultural map. And I remember reading in Steve's book, Developmental Politics, which was several years ago, Steve citing him. So, he's been in the political conversation even before he was elected to the Senate in 2022. So, tough childhood growing up in, Ohio, and, his book was glommed onto after Trump's election as a sort of skeleton key for how to think through, the cultural and economic forces that gave birth to Trump. And so, all the NPR and New York Times, liberal intelligentsia flocking to diners to do, armchair sociology and figure out, what makes these people tick. And so Vance was seen as a kind of ambassador, cultural ambassador into that world. So he spent some time in the Marine Corps. So he's got that kind of military, discipline background in him. He went through Yale Law. He spent some time in San Francisco, the bane of all conservatives, as a venture capitalist, working for Peter Thiel, who I'll come back to in a few minutes. He converted to Catholicism in 2019 in a very public manner. And that's found its way, I think, into his thinking around a lot of social and even economic policy issues. I'll come back to that as well. So elected as a US Senator and, of course, VP elect. Okay, so I wanted to just do a very brief primer on some of the spiral dynamics, colors, and worldviews. I know most people on the call are familiar with this. Some may not be. So I'll just briefly talk about these that I'll reference at times throughout the presentation and say a little bit about how I think Vance does or doesn't, activate them. So the first, the so-called red wave, warrior consciousness, very egocentric, sees the world in terms of predator and prey. The instinct is to fight. So Trump's fight, fight, fight. Jeff Salzman ran a veritable masterclass describing all the ways in which Trump is textbook read. About Vance, I'll quickly say he seemed to start being read once he realized he needed Trump's backing. And he got very good at talking red on talk shows. He's very good at being mean. But I don't think red possesses him in the same way, let's say, it possesses Trump. I think he can access red selectively when it suits his purposes to get the media to pay attention to something that he thinks is important. And if you noticed in the debate, there was barely a touch, I think there was barely a touch of red in terms of his demeanor and how he presented, because it was a very different forum. A lot of people liked him in the debate, I think, partly because he was not as much of a dick in the debate as he is generally on talk shows. He's very combative with reporters. So he knows how to be selectively read when it suits his purposes, but it's not where he hangs out, I don't think. So traditional or the mythic worldview, the blue meme spiral dynamics, typically associated with firm religious belief. There's absolute moral rules laid down by God, ethnocentric right? Tends to prioritize country, tribe, very patriotic, a lot of heart energy, and very good at disciplining red energy, very good at channeling, particularly male, testosterone and male egocentrism in a constructive manner. And I think this is actually where Vance is mostly coming from in terms of the energy that animates him. He's not restricted to that, but I think his conversion to Catholicism drives a lot of his thinking about what's gone wrong in the country. And so the way in which he animates social conservatism is very motored by his personal, I think, appreciation for the value of this structure. The modern rational perspective, so scientific, empirical, more individualistic, think for oneself, don't just conform to the group. My identity is not determined by the role that I play in social groups, but by what I decide to believe based on my own thinking, etc. Entrepreneurial energy, right? The Enlightenment kind of values we think of. So, I think Vance has obviously gotten this download. He spent time in the venture capital world and the business world, quite successful. He went through Yale Law. So in, achievement-based environments, he clearly excels, clearly, I think off the charts from, cognitively. And then postmodern progressive, or the green wave in spiral dynamics, pluralistic, sees the value in multiple cultures, sees the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed, and tends to be most concerned with the least of these and alleviating suffering, making conditions more equal, including concern for the environment, etc. So this is, I think, an area where Vance doesn't seem to demonstrate a lot of concern. Climate change, he's, seems to be borderline climate denial. We should repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. Very much anti-woke. So he rode that anti-woke sentiment quite a bit, as with many other figures on the new right. The one thing I would mention, though, and I'll come back to this later, is there's aspects of his economic thinking that do seem to overlap with some progressive thinking. He is in favor of antitrust legislation. This is one thing that's probably going to create some tension with him and some folks in Trump world, is that he's very on board with endeavors to break up Google and challenge big tech and police markets in a way that many modernists often are not, who tend to want to let the free market just do its thing. And I'm curious to hear later what people think about whether there's any kind of postmodern element to Vance's way of thinking in a way that's not what we tend to think of as progressive left-leaning. So that's something I'm still thinking through myself. I'll reference a few things that I mentioned in my presentation last time, just in terms of situating Vance in our political landscape. So I mentioned that I think that our politics in the year 2000, if we think about it in terms of the spiral, look maybe kind of something like what you see on the left, where orange modernism is the most powerful meme, but it has a foothold in both parties, both red and blue, both Democrats and Republicans. And so there was some overlap and consensus. And I think now, and of course, this is just kind of rough spitballing, we're in something like the situation on the right, where green has grown considerably. Orange is under attack from both green and blue, and there's red all over the place. Everybody's pissed off. Everybody's raging against some kind of machine. And so I think that's very much the environment that Vance is coming up in and succeeding in. Vance is commonly understood as the first, person to ascend to real political prominence on the new right. And so the question that raises, what's the old right? So in spiral terms, I think the old right was understood as what's called fusionism, a fusion of orange modernism. So the more libertarian aspect of the party, the Wall Street side of, free markets and low taxes, low regulation, and then the social conservatives, blue traditional, family values, very, anti-abortion policy, sometimes against same-sex marriage, etc. And it had was seen as a stool with three legs. Free market economics, conservative on cultural issues, and a muscular interventionist foreign policy, standing up for democracy abroad. And this was sort of the Reagan era. And Vance breaks with that in the first and third stools. So he challenges the economic orthodoxy, that I'll come back to that in a few minutes, saying, well, we should have a more interventionist policy with regard to big tech. We should be trying to onshore manufacturing and, building things here. We should have industrial policy that is, the government deciding what sectors of the economy to invest in rather than letting the market decide. He has favored labor rights, sectoral bargaining, workers' councils. He, marched with the United Auto Workers when they struck in 2023. So he holds some economic views that make the old party poobahs and the donor class nervous, and that also sometimes overlap with positions that progressives take on economic issues, which is interesting. Foreign policy, he's sometimes regarded as isolationist. So he is largely against the U.S.'s intervention in the war in Ukraine and our alliance with and support of NATO. Whether he's properly called an isolationist is complicated, but he at least seems to represent a break with the old, more internationalist, neoconservative foreign policy of the Reagan years and then the Bush years. So turning to some influences, first and foremost, and definitely I think most important to think through, is Peter Thiel. Probably needs little introduction for many of you. Thiel co-founded PayPal with Elon Musk. He was the angel investor in Facebook, and he developed what came to be called the PayPal Mafia, and it became kind of the blueprint for modern Silicon Valley. And if there's one book I could recommend to you, it is The Contrarian, which is a biography of Thiel. It is amazingly revealing and informative. In terms of politics, Thiel has, been libertarian generally. He has taken the position, and he's on record taking the position, that freedom and democracy are not compatible. So he also seems to gesture toward supporting authoritarian rule in some unspecified sense. In terms of Trump and Vance, so Thiel, and my understanding is he saved Trump's campaign in 2016 after the Access Hollywood video. Thiel supported him publicly, threw a bunch of money at him. Steve Bannon took over the campaign. He spoke at the RNC, and they won. And he was vilified in Silicon Valley when he did that, but he created a permission structure that many tech titans were to follow in the 2024 election. He introduced Vance to Trump and was the person who lobbied the hardest, my understanding is, for Vance to be on the ticket. Vance also worked for him as a VC for a while. And so, there's both intellectual influence to consider there, as well as, what are the economic incentives and how much does, Vance do what Thiel wants him to do? I don't know what the answers to those questions are, but they're questions to be thinking about. The next one is Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug. Was his pseudonym. He was an internet blogger in the late aughts and 2010s, became very popular in right-wing sort of Reddit circles online. And he advances a philosophy he calls it's been called neo-reaction. So Yarvin believes that American democracy is basically a corrupt oligarchy that is run by elites who serve their own interests rather than the public interest. And he thinks that this is something that spreads not just in government, but it's throughout the media, through universities. And Yarvin calls this wide conspiracy the cathedral of shadow, not so shadowy elites that rule over us. And if you notice in interviews, Vance will refer to what he calls the regime, that we have to resist the regime. That's his translation of Yarvin's phrase, the cathedral, the sort of liberal establishment. And so Yarvin actually was funded by Thiel. Thiel funded one of his companies. He's also a software developer. And he's sort of known as the court philosopher in the Peter Thiel universe. And Vance has said that Yarvin has been influential on him, has given him a lot of ideas. Yarvin identifies as a monarchist, so another sort of professed authoritarian like Thiel, and thinks that basically like enlightened corporations should run things. So it's a very short, kind of overview, but he calls his plan for overthrowing government rage, retire all government employees, rage. And as many of you probably know, a proposal quite like that is in Project 2025. So this idea of, as Vance put it, enacting a de-Bathification of the federal government also has ties to Yarvin and his sort of authoritarian views that we need to, debug the bad programming of the federal government as if it's, poorly designed software. Another influence, and this coming more from the Catholic and religious perspective, is Patrick Deneen, who I've spoken about here before. So Deneen is one of the most prominent post-liberals. He wrote a couple of books over the last several years attacking the liberal establishment and proposing that liberalism as a philosophical and political project, which we could understand broadly as modernity as such, right? Liberalism, orange modernism, has failed because it has an individualistic view that cuts us off from communities and creates a rootless and placeless and faithless citizen, which is to say it erodes citizenship itself and it turns everyone just into selfish and striving consumers. So a bit of a gloss there. But by liberalism, he means not just the left, but the left, the center left, and the right. So even somebody like Mitt Romney would be a liberal in Deneen's sense. And so Vance's rejection of the conservative establishment, the Wall Street crowd, the investor class, the donor class, et cetera, is a function of that. And the Catholicism is important too, because there's a conviction by Deneen and many of the post-liberals that the attempt to build a secular society is ending in disaster. And many of the social and economic ills we see around us are a function of this bogus philosophy. And so we need a kind of re-traditionalism. We need elites who believe in traditional values and change our institutions to help develop traditional virtues in people and help rebuild healthy traditional communities. In spiral terms, the post-liberals, I think, see the world this way. They see religious people as under attack from a hostile, pagan, and red world of selfish, egocentric people. That's how they tend to see people who are orange and green, let's say. They see them as coming from below rather than above. So here's Vance with Deneen in DC, welcoming him for a talk. Here's Deneen meeting with Viktor Orban. Orban, president of Hungary, is sort of the poster boy for the post-liberals. And, Vance speaks very positively of Orban, partly for he breaks with the EU, but partly also because he's trying to build what's sometimes called an illiberal democracy that veers into Christian nationalism and that has extremely pro-family policies. So the Hungarian government really powerfully subsidizes family formation, and it's one of the things that really drives Vance's politics. And behind Deneen in that photo, you can't quite see it, is the next influence, which is Rod Dreher, who I've also talked about here before. He's most famous for his articulation of a kind of crunchy conservatism, the spread of what were often sort of hippie values and lifestyles of grow your own food and make your own clothes and homeschool your kids and retreat into intentional communities, but designed around Christian values, what he calls the Benedict Option. With withdrawing, pull your kids out of public schools, don't let them be indoctrinated by woke, godless liberals, and so on. Vance also has a personal connection to Dreher. Dreher was at his baptism. Dreher is an Orthodox Christian, but they share a lot of the same, I think, critique of what's wrong with sort of modern mainstream secular liberal society. So Dreher is an interesting player in this story because I think the Benedict Option ethos has an unusual combination of blue tradition, but also this kind of green countercultural vibe that's about decentralization and reconnecting with the local. So it's an interesting part of the culture. The next is James Orr, and this represents another plank in the new right that Vance embraces, called national conservatism. Orr is a professor of religion at Cambridge in the UK. And you'll see him on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and he's in that kind of circle with these new intellectuals on the right in the Western world. And he and Vance are have become close personal friends. They both spoke at this conference a number of times, the National Conservative Conference. And this movement is not necessarily religious, but it is this idea that Margaret Thatcher was wrong when she said that there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families. There is such a thing as nations. It's an important unit of political identity, and we ignore it at our peril. And they tend to see multiculturalism as destroying a sense of national identity, of shared borders, shared history, shared identity. And that gets tricky because sometimes it's entangled with ethnocentric ideas of people who look like us and a sort of white nationalist kind of idea. They disavow themselves from that, but it's kind of adjacent and they're difficult to separate. So that's another thing that's driving, I think, Vance's thinking as a more nationalistic conservatism than the old right embraced. Lastly, I'll mention is a tension in Vance himself, I think, and one that's going to play out. We're already starting to see play out with respect to HB1 visas with the Trump administration, is the tension between the techno-accelerationists, the new right, the tech right, which Vance has personal connections with, and not just Thiel. Mark Andreessen also was one of the investors in one of the firms that he used to run. So, and that's part of what greased his way into the highest echelons of power. But part of the thinking about hyper modernism from the standpoint of integral is that it dissolves blue. It dissolves blue tradition. It disrupts things, disrupts settled ways of life. It outsources jobs. It eliminates jobs, builds factories in places that displace people, et cetera. Not to mention what it's doing to, people psychologically. And this is another thing that animates Vance. He's very outspoken about the role that, say, pornography plays in the development of young men and the arrested development of young men that I'll come to in a little bit. So there's a tension between that and another group that Vance has strong ties to, which I called on here before the Prudent Populists. The spokesperson for this is Oren, who runs the American Compass think tank. And I already mentioned this before, so I won't dwell on it, but it's pushing back against the free market consensus and saying we need a more pro-worker economic platform. And think about people less as consumers and more as workers, and more of an economic nationalism. So that's going to be a tension that I think we're going to see play out a lot. About postmodernism, I wanted to throw an idea out there that I thought was really fascinating. I don't know much about it, but it's something worth thinking about. There's a political theorist named Matthew McManus who coined this phrase, postmodern conservatism. I'll just read a quote from him. "The most fundamental weakness of Catholic post-liberalism is that despite the prefix, most of its proponents are reactionaries at heart." He describes the right's descent into an identity politics of its own, namely the call to reassert the authority of certain identity groups that once upon a time were in charge. So it's this idea that there's almost like a shadow postmodern like victim mindset. Oh, we're so oppressed by the left, they're authoritarians, etc. That he thinks has a psychological resonance with the so-called woke left. He writes, "Far from just conserving the achievements of liberalism and going beyond them, they want to turn the clock back to a pre-liberal era where Aristotelian Thomism sorted individuals according to divine hierarchies, and the state took punitive measures against sexual deviants, intellectual dissidents, and heretics without hesitation." And that sort of animus toward the universities, that is as old as the hills in conservative, thinking. William F. Buckley famously, attacked Yale and the secular godless culture there when he was forming what was then the New Right in the 1950s. Vance doing the same, right? Attacking, the Yale, liberal, smug liberal establishment. So that is influences. And I'll just say a couple words to wrap up before we open it up for discussion. In terms of conservatism developmentally, the last talk I gave here, I showed this little illustration of a way to think about the spiral and the importance of blue tradition as the yoke, the thing in the middle that holds everything together. I think the problem, the meta problem, if you like, is the escaping of red into the mainstream culture that confuses everybody and puts everybody in a rage and gets them outraged all the time, and it disconnects people and so on. And the best social technology we have for channeling red is blue. And so the rebuilding of a sturdy, thick, sustainable blue culture is a really important piece of the puzzle to regaining some kind of equilibrium, I think. And I think that's one of the things that really animates Vance and a lot of the new right. Some of it is very red in a very toxic way, I think. But that's also mixed up with well-intentioned efforts to try and establish some sense of order and stability in what's become such a chaotic and confusing society. And I had to say something about childless cat ladies, so I'll end on this note. So obviously this was an extremely and intentionally inflammatory remark, but what was the issue that it was in the context of? And this is where I will leave us before we go off for discussion. There's three interrelated long-term civilizational issues that I think are in the air. We're in the air in the election and really animate Vance. And one is children, the so-called, fertility crisis of declining birth rates across most of the world. The second is the place of men and masculinity in our politics. And the third is the future of Christianity. And I think they all overlap. I got to admit, I was late to the party on realizing how big in world historical the eventual decline of the global population is likely to be with dropping birth rates. And there doesn't seem to be any consensus yet on policies that help reverse declining birth rates, below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman once they dip below that. And so I think Vance is it's like the climate change of the right. As apocalyptic as progressives see climate change on the left, that's how people on the right, I think, see the fertility crisis. They see it as a civilizational threat. And for Vance and a lot of folks on the right, I think they see the crisis in masculinity as connected with that young men are not getting married, they're not forming families, they're not becoming productive members of society, et cetera. So you've got to fix that problem to fix the children problem. And Christianity, as the dominant sort of mythic story in the West, it's probably going to have to fit in some way into that story that we tell ourselves about what we're doing, because it's so associated with the traditional structure that is very good at channeling red, forming families, et cetera, and that as a foundation for healthy societies. So that's something that those are big long-term issues that are going to have to be fixed, because if we don't figure out a healthy place for men, we're going to get unhealthy expressions of the masculine. And a lot of that is, I think, what we saw with the election. And if the left doesn't figure out how to marry Christianity to its economic and social policies, then we're going to get an unhealthy Christian nationalism on the right. So hopefully Vance can, cut out the red from MAGA in the future, but I don't know. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing your reactions and ideas.
Great. Thanks, David. Should we just jump right into Q&A and discussion here?
Cool. Sounds good.
All right. All right. So if you have a question, a comment, a reflection, please use the react button to raise your hand. It's the little heart at the bottom of your screen. Click the raise hand button, and I'll kind of see everyone up at the top of my screen. I'll do my best calling everyone. All right, so let's start off with Charles and then Michael. Great. Charles, go for it.
Great, thanks, Rachel. David, thanks for this. I really appreciate your analysis. I read Hillbilly Elegy when it came out and was really liked what I read. I grew up not quite hillbilly, but hillbilly adjacent in in Virginia, North Carolina, and I saw a lot there that I could identify with, and I've been less friendly to some of the ways that Vance has been showing up recently, as some of which you described. But you asked two things that piqued my interest earlier that I have a perspective on. One of them was, I think, to write Hillbilly Elegy post-Marine Corps, post-Yale Law, post getting out and being successful, and show the level of ability to see, but also to sympathize with his extended family full of red energy. To me, that shows neither blue nor orange stereotypically can do that. And so for me, that means pluralistic or higher. There's got to be something there to be able to see and resonate with those lower tiers, which I think points me to the second thought. And I can't remember if this was your words or somebody else's, but the idea of an integral conservative leader. The way that I have heard yellow in second tier construed is that the spiral is beginning to repeat itself, and yellow lines up with beige, and therefore one of the commonalities is a high attention on survivability, on effectiveness, on what does it take to keep going. And I think with the varied and sometimes contrarian choices that he seems to make about what he supports and what he discounts, even though I often don't particularly agree with the things that he supports or discounts, that feels to me like it could be that second tier yellow emphasis on survival and maybe an overly aggressive cure, in quotes, for the green, the usually unconscious green conflation of pragmatic and moral reasoning that says, well, our way is not only the best way, but it's also the right way and the only right way. Yellow comes along and says, no, wait, Orban's got some things that are right here. And so does, Sanders, and so does, and it's something like that shows up for me. And that I wanted to put that out there and see how that resonates for you.
Yeah. Well, that's exquisite comment. Lots of things I could say. The one thing I'll say is you're reminding me of an episode from early in the campaign when one of Vance's classmates at Yale, who was a trans woman, who was a close friend of his, shared this dump of text messages between them with a reporter. And there was the very caring and loving and empathetic Vance that you were gesturing toward, and how he shows up in the memoir. And even the ability to write a serious, thoughtful memoir, right? It's a sign. It's telling that Trump needed a ghostwriter, right, to write his memoir, and Vance didn't. So yeah, I'd have to think more about what you're talking about with Yellow. But yeah, that's kind of my intuition, is that he's got this eclectic set of life experiences and influences. And so there's got to be more going on there than just he's a shill for Silicon Valley, duping the traditionalists, or he's a mean-spirited Christian nationalist. So that's one of the things I think is fascinating about him. He's hard to untangle. Yeah. Thanks for your comment.
Cool. Thanks, David.
All right, we're going to go to Michael Poots and then Carter Phipps.
Well, thank you. This is my first time in this group, so I appreciate it. I just introduced myself briefly. I worked with Wilbur in the beginning of the Integral Institute 25 years ago on the Integral Institute of Business and Leadership. And so I was, this has been interesting to dip myself back into the integral stream, because I was very much into it 25 years ago. And when I was, appreciate your presentation, David. And one of the things I wanted to highlight was I really appreciate your diagram showing sort of an impressionistic view of the distribution of levels, and how you were mentioning orange was getting squeezed by blue and green, and that there was a massive increase in red. And it brought me back to an uncomfortable theme, that Wilbur talked about boomeritis 25 years ago in a classic book about the mean green meme. What has been stunning is that he talked about this alliance between a degraded green and red long ago. That was an observation. It wasn't a scientific assertion, but it was an observation which seems to have face validity to it. And 25 years later, oh boy, it has that picture seems to be a regression and reaction to extreme postmodernism, that people, especially in the blue category, are driven in life conditions towards a reaction to red, because green is, in its pluralism, trying to extinguish blue. I mean, that's just an obvious, the deplorable comments, the activities, and the extinguishment of the means, calling them everybody a bigot and backwards, and instead of, as Wilbur would say 1,000 times, accepting the spiral of development. And I was thinking about Wilbur's paper from 8 years ago about post-Trump in a post-truth world. And I missed the first beginning of your presentation, so if you referenced it already, I apologize. But I was thinking that paper was pretty descriptive of the fact that he saw Trump as an unconscious, clearly not conscious, an unconscious reaction to the excesses of green, and he had channeled all of that unconscious reactivity to being, if there was the unifying element of Trump was he was anti-green, right? Mm-hmm. He could speak to red, he could speak to blue, and he could speak to orange, And he didn't necessarily embody a positive transformative vision, but he was clearly against the green that was taking over all the elite institutions and was not really representing the interest of people. And the COVID pandemic made that even worse, bringing back. And so 8 years later, from Trump's initial election and Wilbur's diagnosis, it seems to be there's been an explosion of narcissism in the culture. And we could talk about 1,000 different reasons for that. But I think thinking that, and that coming to Vance, Wilbur was saying 8 years ago that this was a sort of like unconscious reaction. I think Vance, in his own journey from hillbilly elegy to calling Trump an American Hitler, right, to where he was basically saying the system is broken. I have to work with this person in this corrupt individual to basically, in a broken, messed up world, I have to make alliances. And I think I see Vance having a sort of proto-integral perspective of trying to basically respond intuitively. I doubt Vance has ever read these books.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I just want to respond to a number of things you said that you've made me think of, and I want to leave some time for other folks to get their questions in. Yeah, so I hadn't referenced Wilbur's Trump in a Post-Truth World in the presentation earlier, but I did read it, and what you made me think of is something that Vance said also during the campaign, when it was about the cats and dogs in Springfield, and he said to one of the reporters, well, if I have to make up stories in order to get you to pay attention to this thing over here that's important, then I'm going to do that. That seems to be this, self-conscious. We're in a post-truth media environment, and so I'm going to say something that's not true in order to get the media to focus on the things it doesn't focus on because of its woke ideology. Whether you think that he's right about that, I think that does seem to betray some awareness of these dynamics at play, but still a firm commitment to truth, and what he thinks is most important, but willing to use lies in the to redirect the discourse to get the spotlight of attention where it should be. So lots more I could say, but yeah, I think that analysis from Wilbur is super important to understanding the last 10 years.
Cool.
Carter, I think you were next.
Yeah, let's go Carter, Michael Grady, and then Pippa.
Hi, David. Thanks for that. That's really, it was great presentation. I have a question, maybe a comment and a question, which you may not be able to answer. Of course, you probably can't answer, but I'd love to get your deeper reflections on it. Which is that tension in MAGA and in Vance himself that I don't see where he's going to come down on, between like those who sort of think this is just the extension of the Reagan Revolution, and that version of it, and then those who think this is something totally new, and this is economic populism, and this is rethinking the way in which the country is constructed. As a side note, it's interesting to me that in this movement, in the same way that postmoderns were so guilty at one point of just the fantasies that they could overturn culture and remake society without any kind of evolutionary, sort of pragmatic evolutionary approach, sort of a revolutionary thing. You see that a lot in these movements, actually, which is, I think, also kind of a postmodern current that's come into these movements. But yeah, do you have any sense of where, the tension between the H-1B visa was the perfect example of it, right? Are we economic populist? Is Oren Cass leading this way? Trump sort of is bestride all this, but I think a lot of people in the Trump movement think this is just an extension of the Reagan Revolution. We're kind of going back to that. This is really not something new. Vance leans the other way, but he hasn't come down strongly on any of it. And it's not clear where Elon is there either, because Elon tends. So, what's your sense? Do you have a sense of where he really stands with that? And Thiel's kind of an interesting character here because he's a little more libertarian too, even though he's got these other sides. I'm just curious to see what's your having studied this, what's your intel about Vance and where he comes down on this, or does he even know?
Well, I don't have special intel, but yeah, I mean, as I think gestured toward the end of the presentation, I think this is the question. This is the whatever $20 million question. Like, is it faux populism, or is it the real thing? I think he's going to. I think he actually is well intentioned. That's just my, again, kind of my gut feeling.
And where would that lean him?
Oh, I think that would lean him toward the Oren Cass, like industrial policy, reinvesting in manufacturing,
isolationism, a little more.
I mean, just one little wonky thing I'll say quickly is I think that this talk about repealing the Inflation Reduction Act stuff, you're not going to hear anything else about that, because most of the money is going to be spent over the next few years, and 80% of that is going to be in red counties. And it's going to create a lot of jobs, and they'll take credit for it, and fine. And, you know, Biden won't get any credit for it, and whatever. Like, as long as, like, healthy blue communities get rebuilt in the heartland, like, that's what matters, ultimately, not who gets credit. I think that's what he wants to do longer term. Because, I mean, could you imagine being him right now? You know that you're probably going to be the head of what becomes of the movement for the next 20 years, 15, 20 years, whatever it is. And to separate yourself from Trump and all the ugly red stuff he's done to the culture. But I think he's going to struggle, because I think the financial interests are just too great. And the Elons and the Thiels and the other powerful interests, you know, the CEOs of mining companies and, you know, the unsexy, non-techie, like, billionaires, like, they're probably going to get what they want. So I think he's going to struggle to redirect the engine of world history, if you like, because it's capital. So that's, you know, some rough thoughts, but thanks for the great question.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Let's go to Michael, Pippa, and then Matt.
Hey, a great talk. And I guess what we're struggling with, what you're struggling with, is who is this guy? He's the whole of this going, and because it's coming. And I like that you just jumped right over Trump's 4 years, and you're thinking, what are we going to do in 4 years? And that's interesting. When I see what's happening, perhaps, I don't know if you do, is that with Elon, who was a professed Democrat, RFK Jr., we have Vance, who started off, called him Hitler and flipped on him, is that they're taking these strands, different kind of party. We're going to pull something different together, and we're going to show the world that we're the ones who can pull this together. And I would love to be a fly on was talking to Vance about his comments about Hitler. And, you know, I think I really do believe Trump is just a lot of it's very performative for him. He's shaking up the culture. He wants people to get angry. He wants people to fight. He wants to push back on all this, you know, identitarian weak stuff that we think about. And he wants people to come together and have a fighting energy as a country again. society, perhaps. And it's just going to be a mess. I mean, do you see that the same way? Like, it's interesting that Trump, the disruptor, brought together these guys who started out as professed Democrats and liberals, and something's happening behind the scenes. He's saying, look, we have to do this. We have to come together. We have to kind of, whether we're going to be populists, what we're going to be for, we've got to be for the future. We have a future to sort out here.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I'll just briefly say, there was a quote from James Orr, his British Sherpa, the national conservative, that stuck out to me. And it was something like, the tech bro side of JD actually fits with the trad bro side of JD, and that they're both future oriented. The future oriented aspect of the trad bro thing is we need to have children and have families and think in an intergenerational manner.
Right.
And that's, kind of contra what they see as the stagnation of progressivism, and a kind of dwelling on past, grievances and past injustices, and an obsession with redressing all the wrongs of history. And so, yeah, I think that tilt of the future tilt is something that attracts him to those tech titans who were former Democrats. What I think makes him a more complex thinker is the religious aspect. In that, I think he gets the importance of traditionalism as a strata in a way that someone like Musk doesn't. I think Musk is mostly sees things in terms of the right quadrants. I don't think he gets interiority, and I think that's what makes Vance maybe somehow interestingly integral, is that he has an awareness of the importance of the interior quadrants. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Let's go to Pippa and then Matt.
Yeah. Thank you. Great talk.
So sort of taking off from that part of the conversation, what's interesting and almost a little bit confusing to me about how we're structuring this conversation is there's this idea of what is an integral conservative or a postmodern conservative. And the way we've structured this conversation, it seems like blue is, or modern, whatever that is, I forget what color, is sort of the center. And there's two ways to respond to that, either sort of postmodern, or which is, Democrat at this point, some kind of liberal, or progressive is another word, or the way we're talking about conservative is sort of going backwards or the other way towards traditional. So by that definition, it seems like we can't possibly have a conservative green or conservative integral. So I feel like I'm missing something. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And I'm really intrigued by thinking through that idea. But the other point I wanted to bring up is in your last diagram, you had men as a question to think about, children as a question to think about, and Christianity as a thing to think about. But I feel like instead of children, what we're really talking about is women, because that's where children come from, right? That's where a lot of these conversations pivot, and why I think we have so much difference between how women are responding right now to all of these questions. For example, first person, myself, I'm of a generation that has, the tech to not have children. Like I have birth control, right? That allows me in some ways to be a man. And that is so exciting to me. And so when these questions come up of, becoming more traditional as a culture, what that really says to me as a woman is taking away my ability to, in some ways be a man, to be agentic, to not be an other.
Yeah.
So that's a really important, I think, omission from your diagram.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll respond to both of those good points. With respect to the second point, I think it's not about either or. I mean, I could have written families in there instead of children. And I think that is the important advance of the postmodern strata, is that it appreciates the masculine in women and the feminine in men. And it creates more opportunities for people to embrace and live out in public the complexity of their gender and have it be not reduced to their sex. I do think an aspect of Vance's, let's say, post-Trump turn persona is unduly hostile to women, broadly speaking. Particularly the childless cat lady's, remark. But with regard to the first point you mentioned, so embracing traditionalism doesn't mean regressing wholesale, from modernism or progressivism to traditionalism. It's kind of like the integral mindset is almost like a nested doll. So both our individual identities and social identities are complex, and each strata emerged because it performs certain important functions psychologically and socially. And so we need it. We need more than it, but we need it. And the danger as you move up the spiral is each new level tries to kick out the rungs of the ladder of the rung before it. Whereas it needs to be preserved to some extent. So that's a very kind of brief, crude idea, but an integral conservative would want to conserve traditionalism and modernism and progressivism, because they would recognize that those are all important parts of our identity and our culture. They're all traditions in a sense. So a traditional conservative doesn't think that way. They see liberalism and progressivism as evil. They see it as what I was describing as red before. So a more capacious conservative mindset would see the need to preserve the best of all of those different value sets. So there's more I could say, but thanks for your points.
Great. All right, go with Matt. See if we can make it quick, Matt.
I don't think there's time. I'm going to happily defer to somebody who's got a quickie.
Okay, Patricia, do you have a quick one?
I'll try to make it quick. I'm a little nervous about even coming on the screen because there's a piece of this conversation which I have appreciated greatly. So thank you so much for putting this all together. So this comes from, are we allowing the different things that we're talking about also to have greater bandwidth? So this comes from the fact I'm 72 and I converted to Catholicism because I had a mystical experience. Whoa. And so again, I have thought a lot about the Catholic tradition because I was pretty much an enemy of the Catholics forever. But I had this experience, and by delving into the mystical aspect of this tradition, it's a whole other world. And of course, we're not expecting, J.D. Vance to be a mystic, but the tradition itself holds more than we're allowing for in this conversation. And I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thanks for all your questions and for joining, everybody. 2 quick points. Rigel, is there a way we can copy the chat? Because I've been noticing like dozens and dozens of posts that I haven't had time to read because I was presenting and answering questions, and it looks like there's lots of cool comments, rich stuff to engage with on there. So we can save that?
Yeah.
Great. And then last point is Buttigieg, Vance, 2028 debate. for my money, that's the debate that we deserve to have. And I hope that both of them will be articulating anti-neoliberal economic policies from the left and the right. And that's a complementary kind of dance and debate that I think we deserve, because I think they both have an integral-ish air about them. So here's hoping.
That would be awesome. Well, thank you so much, David.
Thanks, David.
One last quick announcement. Our next meetup, it's the second Wednesday of every month, is going to be with Steve McIntosh. Steve, do you want to just say something real quick about what you're going to be presenting?
Sure. I'm going to talk about the different kinds of spirituality, the big categories of spirituality, not the specific religions that are vying for our cultural allegiance at this moment, and the dialectical tensions between them, and what it means to have an integral spiritual pluralism. What does that look like? And how does it transcend, polite green pluralism when it comes to different religions? So building on, our discussion the past couple of weeks about political pluralism, next month we're going to talk about spiritual pluralism.
Awesome. All right, you all have a fantastic evening, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Rigel.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
David, thanks, everyone.